There's a place where the evening comes slowly, where the light doesn't just disappear, it steps back, like someone leaving a room quietly so as not to wake anyone. The sky turns from gold to amber to the softest shade of lavender, and the air gets just a little cooler, just enough to feel like a gentle hand resting on your shoulder. You don't need to do anything right now. You don't need to be anywhere. The night is already here, and it has been waiting for you. Not with urgency, not with anything pressing. Just waiting the way a warm room waits, open and still and ready. This is where our story begins. In a small village nestled between two gentle hills, there was a woman named Marin. She was neither young nor old. She was the kind of age where a person has learned enough to be peaceful and still curious enough to find wonder in small things. She had quiet eyes, the color of deep water on a cloudy afternoon, and hands that moved slowly and with purpose, the way someone moves when they are not trying to prove anything. Marin lived at the edge of the village in a stone cottage with a low thatched roof and a garden that grew in cheerful, unplanned abundance. Lavender pressed up against the stone walls. A fig tree leaned over the front gate as if listening in on conversations. Roses climbed without being asked, and nobody minded. The cottage had belonged to her grandmother, and before that, to her grandmother's grandmother, and somewhere in its walls and floorboards, and the worn groove on the front step, there was the accumulated quiet of many lives lived gently. Inside, the cottage smelled of woodsmoke and dried herbs, and something faintly sweet that Marin could never quite name. She had stopped trying to name it. Some things were better simply breathed in. On the evening our story opens, Marin was sitting in her favorite chair beside the window, watching the light change over the hills. The chair was old and softly upholstered, and it had shaped itself to her over many years, until it held her the way a cupped hand holds water. A cup of chamomile tea cooled on the table beside her. The last of the firelight touched the edge of her face and made everything in the room feel amber and slow. She had had a long week, not a difficult one, not unhappy, but the kind of week that accumulates like a quiet snowfall, soft flake by soft flake, until you look up and realize that everything has been covered in the effort of ordinary days. She had worked and helped and listened and given, and now she was here in her chair in the amber light, with no more to give and no one asking. And that was exactly right. On the small table beside her tea, there was a letter. It had arrived 3 days ago, carried by a young man on a bicycle with a red fender, and Marin had set it carefully on the table without opening it. She knew who it was from. She could tell by the handwriting, those long, looping letters. The ink always pressed a little too deep into the paper because her old friend Sella wrote the way she lived, with full attention. Marin had been saving the letter the way you save a piece of something delicious, waiting until the moment felt right. Tonight felt right. She reached for it now, turned it over in her hands once, then slipped one finger under the flap. The paper inside was the color of cream. It smelled very faintly of cedar. Sella always kept her letters in a cedar box before sending them, a habit she had inherited from her mother, who believed that cedar kept the words from going stale. Marin smiled even before she began to read. The letter said, "I have found the most extraordinary place, a valley I never knew existed, 2 hours east of the coast. There are orchards. There is an inn. There are people there who seem to have understood something the rest of the world keeps forgetting. I cannot explain it in a letter. You must come. Take the road past the salt marshes and follow the sound of water. You will know it when you feel it." And then, below that, in smaller handwriting, as if added as an afterthought, "Bring your good walking shoes. And yourself. That is all you need." Marin folded the letter slowly along its original creases and held it for a moment between both hands. She had not traveled anywhere in 2 years, not since the long season of helping, when her mother had grown frail and needed tending. Those had been gentle years, full of love, but they had kept her close to home, and she had grown small in her geography without quite noticing. The hills outside her window, the lane to the village, the market on Thursdays. These were her coordinates. They were enough. But reading Sella's words now, something in her chest opened just slightly, like a window latch giving way on a spring morning. Follow the sound of water. She looked out at the hills. The sky had gone fully lavender now, deepening at the edges toward a soft indigo. The first star had appeared, small and patient. Marin took a long, slow sip of her tea. It was cooler than she liked, but she drank it anyway, and it tasted of honey and thyme. She decided she would go. Not tomorrow, not even necessarily next week. But she would go, and the deciding of it filled the cottage with a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet of something that has already begun. She set the letter on the mantel, where she would see it in the morning. Then she let the firelight do what firelight does best, which is hold you gently in place and let the night begin. 3 mornings later, Marin packed a bag. She did not pack heavily. She had learned over the years that the things you think you need and the things you actually need are rarely the same list. And somewhere in the discarding of the extra weight, something relieves itself in you, some tightness you didn't know you were carrying. She took 2 changes of clothing, folded with care, a small pouch of loose chamomile and a tin cup for steeping, her walking shoes, worn to the shape of her feet, which always made her feel as though she was standing on something that already knew her. A notebook, not for writing down important things, but for writing down small things, which she had always believed were the more important kind. A scarf the color of warm terracotta, which her mother had given her years ago, and which Marin wore whenever she needed to feel accompanied. She looked around the cottage before she left. The fire was banked. The windows were latched. The roses outside would go on climbing without supervision, and the fig tree would lean over the gate for its own mysterious reasons, and everything would be here when she returned. There was comfort in that. The world did not require her continuous attention in order to continue. She locked the door, put the key in her coat pocket, and walked down the lane toward the road that led east. The morning was cool and clear, the kind that feels ironed flat by a night of good weather. The light was low and golden, coming at an angle that made everything cast long, soft shadows. Marin's breath made small clouds in the air. Her shoes found the familiar rhythm of walking the left, and then the right, and then the slow, quiet accumulation of distance. And she felt something in her shoulders begin to let go. The road east took her first through the heart of the village. At this hour, the baker had already been up for hours, and the smell of bread from the open window of his shop was almost unbearably good, warm and yeasty, and deeply reassuring. The smell of something that has been made with attention. She stopped and bought a small round loaf, still warm, and wrapped it in the cloth she'd brought for exactly this purpose. The baker was a tall man with a quiet manner. He handed her the bread and looked at her bag and said only, "Somewhere good, I hope." And she said, "I think so." And that was enough of a conversation. She walked past the library, past the churchyard with its old stone walls and its sleeping symmetry, past the schoolhouse where the windows were still dark because the children wouldn't arrive for 2 more hours. She liked the village at this hour. It had the quality of a thought that hasn't yet been spoken, full of intention, quietly held. Then the lane widened into the road, and the road widened into the open landscape, and the village fell away behind her the way all familiar things eventually do when you begin moving towards something new. The salt marshes Sella had mentioned were about an hour's walk from the village. Marin had never been to them, or rather she had been once, years ago, on a gray November afternoon that had not shown them at their best. She had thought of them as flat and colorless and a little melancholy. But today, under the low golden morning light, they were something entirely different. They stretched out on either side of the road like living paintings. The water in the shallow pools caught the light and threw it back in fragments, not the blinding kind of brightness, but the soft kind, the kind that asks you to look slowly. Sedge grass moved in the light breeze, silver and green and gold at the tips. A heron stood on one long leg in the middle of a pool, so perfectly still it might have been a brushstroke. Marin stopped walking and simply looked for a moment. She had been here before and never seen this, not because the marshes had changed, but because she had. That thought settled into her quietly, without weight. She tore off a piece of bread and ate it as she walked. It was still faintly warm inside, and the crust made a soft sound when she broke it, and the taste was simple and full and complete. There are meals that nourish and meals that comfort, and this bread was both. The road curved gently to the right past the marshes, and then to the left, and then it ran straight for a long while between fields that had been recently turned, the dark earth fragrant and open. A pair of wood pigeons flew low over the field and landed somewhere in the hedgerow. The sky above was a pale, clear blue, the kind of blue that seems very far away and very still, as if it too is resting. Sella's instructions had said, "Follow the sound of water." Marin listened as she walked. For a long time, there was only the sound of her own footsteps, and the birds, and the breeze moving through the tall grass along the verge. But then, around a bend, where the road dipped down between 2 low banks of hawthorn, she heard it. Not a rushing sound, not a waterfall or a quick stream. Something lower and slower than that, a sound that was less like water moving and more like water being at peace, a sound with depth and continuity, a sound that felt older than the road and older than the fields and possibly older than the hills themselves. She stopped again and closed her eyes. There it was, the sound of water simply being. When she opened her eyes, she saw that the hawthorn banks were giving way to a different kind of landscape ahead. The road descended gently, and below it, through a gap in the trees, there was a valley she had not known existed. She had lived 20 years within 2 hours of this place, and she had never known it was here. She breathed in slowly. Then she followed the sound of water down. The valley opened itself gradually, like a slow breath. At first, it was only a glimpse, a brightness between the trees, a change in the quality of the air, something green and alive and unhurried. Then the road curved one final time, and the trees fell back, and the valley was simply there, wide and cupped between the hills like water held in 2 gentle hands. The floor of the valley was a patchwork of orchards and meadows, and a winding river that caught the light and gave it back in pieces. The trees in the orchards were heavy with late season fruit, some kind of apple Marin couldn't immediately name, small and flushed with red, hanging with what she could only describe as patience. On the far side of the valley, the hills rose again in long, slow curves, covered in woodland that had turned all the colors of turning amber, bronze, the deep, almost red of oak leaves in October. There were a handful of low stone buildings in the valley floor, arranged without any particular geometry, as if they had arrived there one at a time over many years and simply stayed where they felt comfortable. Smoke rose from one chimney. Somewhere, a door opened and closed. A dog walked across a path and lay down in a patch of sunlight. Marin stood at the top of the road and took this in. The word that came to her was not beautiful, though it was that. The word was settled, as if the valley had found, over centuries, the exact arrangement of itself that required no further adjustment. She walked down. The road became a track, wide enough for a cart, with grass growing in the middle stripe between the wheel ruts. The grass was still damp with morning dew, and her shoes made a soft, crushing sound as she walked through it. On either side, the orchard trees stood in loose rows, their roots disappearing into the long, unmown grass below, their branches overhead making a loose canopy that the light came through in long, slanted shafts. She put out a hand as she walked and touched the bark of one tree. It was warm from the morning sun, warmer than the air, the way stone gets warm, and deeply textured, ridged, and furrowed like a map of a life lived in weather. She kept her hand there for a moment. The tree did not react, but it felt, in some way that Marin couldn't explain, like the tree was aware of being touched. She had always been like that, noticing small things that other people didn't notice, and then wondering if the noticing made her unusual or simply awake. The track ended at a low wooden gate, and beyond the gate was a courtyard of flat gray stones, worn smooth by years of footsteps. There was a well at the center of the courtyard, covered with a wooden roof weathered to silver. There were clay pots along the walls containing things that had finished blooming, but hadn't been cleared yet, not out of neglect, she could tell, but out of the philosophy that a spent flower still has something to say. And against the far wall of the courtyard, there was the inn. It was 2 stories, built of the same pale stone as everything else in the valley, with wide, low windows and a door painted the deep blue-green of the sea on a calm day. A sign hung above the door on a wrought iron bracket. It said simply, "The Still House." Marin read the name twice. It was exactly right. Before she could reach for the latch, the door opened, and a woman came out carrying a basket of apples. She was perhaps 10 years older than Marin, with white hair pinned loosely at her neck, and the kind of unhurried way of moving that suggests a person who has made peace with time. She looked at Marin without surprise, as if guests arrived regularly at this hour, on foot, with bags over their shoulders and quiet expressions. "You must be Sella's friend," the woman said. Her voice was low and even. "She said you'd come." "She was right," Marin said. "She usually is. I'm Teodora. I keep this place." The woman shifted the basket to her other arm. "Come in and let me show you your room. Then there's coffee. And this afternoon there are apples to press if you'd like something to do with your hands." That was all the welcome Marin needed. Not effusive, not formal, just warm and practical and exactly the right amount. She followed Teodora through the blue-green door into the inn. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of stone and apples, and a fire that had been burning steadily for a long time. The hallway was narrow and low-ceilinged, with a flagstone floor and wooden beams overhead, and 2 oil lamps on a shelf that were not currently lit, but looked as though they had been used often and with appreciation. The walls were hung with a few simple things: a woven textile in earth tones, a small mirror, a watercolor of the valley in summer that had been painted by someone who understood the importance of negative space. Teodora led her up a set of wooden stairs that creaked pleasantly under their feet, then down a short hallway to a room at the end. She opened the door and stood back. The room was small and entirely right. A bed with a white coverlet and pillows that looked like they had been recently put in the sun and brought back still warm. A window overlooking the orchard. A wooden chair and a small writing table where someone had placed a candle and a cup of dried rosemary, as if they knew she might want to write. The floor was wide planked oak, pale with age, covered with a single woven rug in cream and soft gold. "There's a hot water bottle under the coverlet," Teodora said. "It'll have cooled by now, but it keeps the sheets from being cold." Marin set her bag on the chair and looked out the window at the orchard. The trees were very still. The light was coming through them at an angle that made the fruit glow from within, as if the apples were carrying their own small warmth. "It's exactly as she described," Marin said quietly. "Most people say that," Teodora replied, and smiled and left. Sella arrived that afternoon. Marin was in the orchard, sitting at the base of an apple tree with her back against its trunk, and her notebook open on her knee, when she heard the sound of footsteps on the track. She looked up, and there was Sella, coming through the low wooden gate with a bag on each shoulder, her dark hair windblown, her face bright with the kind of happiness that is slightly out of breath. They had not seen each other in nearly 2 years. For a moment, they only looked at each other across the courtyard. Sella laughed, not loudly, but with her whole chest, the laugh that Marin had known for 30 years, the one that started deep and came out warm and crossed the courtyard in long, easy strides and put her arms around Marin. And they held each other the way old friends do, with full weight, without the slight awkwardness of people who are still deciding how close to stand. "You came," Sella said. "Of course I came," Marin said. "You almost didn't. I could tell by how long it took you to open the letter." Marin laughed now too, a sound she hadn't heard herself make in weeks. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I know you," Sella said simply. They pulled apart and looked at each other properly. There was the small reckoning that always happens between people who haven't seen each other in a long time, the quiet noting of how time has moved, without judgment, just observation. A few more lines, a little more gray, and underneath all of it, completely unchanged, the essential quality of the person, the particular light that only they carry. "You look tired," Sella said, not unkindly. "As a fact, I was," Marin said. "I think I'm less so now. The valley does something." Sella nodded as if this required no further explanation. "Wait until tonight. There are no other lights for miles. The stars here are extraordinary." They sat together under the apple tree for a while, talking in the way they always talked, not in a straight line, but circling around and through things, one subject leading naturally to another, and then doubling back, like a path through woods that seems to wander, but always brings you home. They talked about small things, about Marin's garden and Sella's work, and the price of good olive oil, and a film they had both seen and felt differently about. They talked about Marin's mother, gently and briefly, the way you touch something that is still tender. And then they were quiet together, and that was as good as the talking. The light in the orchard changed as the afternoon moved. The shadows lengthened, and the quality of the light shifted from bright and direct to something warmer and more angled, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look as though it is being seen for the last time and found beautiful. A breeze moved through the trees, and a few leaves came down, not urgently, not falling so much as descending, taking their time, choosing their landing. Teodora appeared with a tray that she set on the flat stone beside the well. On it were 2 cups of something hot, and a small plate of the inn's bread, and a jar of fig jam with a spoon. She said nothing, just set it down and went back inside, and Marin understood that this was how things happened here, quietly, with attention, without ceremony. Jam was dark and faintly spiced, the figs having been grown in the valley, Marin guessed, since everything here seemed to come from the valley. It tasted of long, slow summer, of heat and patience and sweetness that had been arrived at over a long time. She spread it on a thick slice of bread and ate it, and felt, very specifically, held. That was the word she had been reaching for since she arrived. Not comforted, though it was that. Not safe, though it was that too. The feeling was more particular than either of those. It was the feeling of being held, not restrained, not managed, but the way you are held when you fall asleep somewhere that knows you, and the world goes on being the world while you rest. She wrote the word in her notebook, just the single word, held. Then she underlined it once and closed the book. "What do people do here?" she asked Sella. Sella looked at the orchard, at the river just visible through the trees, at the smoke from the inn's chimney against the pale afternoon sky. The same things people do everywhere, she said, but slower and on purpose. Later, as the sun dropped behind the western hill and the valley filled with a soft blue dusk, they helped Teodora, and 2 other guests pressed the afternoon's harvest of apples. The press was an old wooden one in the low barn at the edge of the courtyard, its mechanisms worn to a particular smoothness by generations of use. It smelled magnificently of apple and wood and thyme. They took turns loading the press and turning the great wooden screw and watching the pale gold juice run down the channel into the waiting vessel. It was work that required just enough attention to quiet the mind without exhausting it. The best kind of work, Marin had always thought. The kind that asks you to be present without demanding anything else. By the time they finished, the dusk had become evening, and the first stars were appearing above the ridge of the eastern hill. Sella had been right about the stars. Marin stood in the courtyard with apple-scented hands and looked up. Dinner at the still house was eaten at a long wooden table in the low-ceilinged room that served as both kitchen and dining room. There were 7 people that evening, Marin and Sella, Teodora, a young couple from the coast who had walked to the valley on a whim and stayed longer than they planned, an older man named Percival who came every year at this time and had been doing so for 40 years, and a quiet woman named Inez who seemed to be writing something and offered almost no information about herself, but listened to everything with great attention. The food was simple and deeply satisfying. A soup made from the squash growing in the kitchen garden, orange and silky, seasoned with something Marin couldn't identify, but suspected was a mixture of cumin and something sweeter. Bread from the morning. A salad of late greens with walnuts and the kind of cheese that crumbles when pressed. Pears poached in wine for dessert, soft and yielding, in shallow bowls with a little cream. Conversation moved around the table the way firelight moves, finding places to rest, then shifting, then settling again. Nobody performed. Nobody filled silences unnecessarily. The young couple from the coast spoke about the walk that had brought them here and what they had seen along the way, and their voices were easy with the specific happiness of people who have recently surprised themselves by being braver than they expected. Percival talked about the valley in other seasons. The valley in deep winter, he said, was its own kind of extraordinary. The orchards bare, and the frost on the grass, and the river low in its banks, and the silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. Inez looked up from her bowl at that, and wrote something quickly in the small notebook she kept beside her plate. Marin ate and listened, and felt the particular pleasure of being among people who are comfortable enough to be themselves without effort. After the meal, they stayed at the table for a long time. Teodora brought a bottle of something, a local brandy, amber and warm, served in small glasses. Nobody drank quickly. The fire in the large hearth at one end of the room had been built up and cast a generous warmth. The dog Marin had seen that morning was asleep under the table, occasionally sighing in his sleep with a sound that was so perfectly content It made her smile every time. Percival, who had the unhurried manner of someone who has stopped worrying about making an impression, told a story about his first visit to the valley 40 years ago, when the road in had been little more than a cattle path, and there had been no inn. Only Teodora's grandmother living in the stone cottage, who had fed him bread and eggs, and let him sleep in the barn without asking a single question. "I'd been walking for 3 days," he said. "I was 22, and I'd just finished something very difficult, a year I don't need to describe. I found this valley because I got lost. I was simply lost, and then I was here, and something happened that I still can't explain, except to say that something in me that had been very tight simply let go, like a rope someone had been pulling on for a long time and suddenly stopped pulling." Everyone at the table understood this without needing to say so. The understanding moved around the table quietly, the way such things do between people who have each known their own version of that rope. "And you keep coming back," the young woman from the coast said. "Every year," Percival said. "The world is full of places, but there are only a few places that seem to know you." Marin turned her glass slowly in her hands. She thought about her cottage, which knew her. She thought about Sella's arms that afternoon, which knew her. She thought about the chair beside the fire at home, shaped to her. And now this valley, which she had found at exactly the moment she had needed to find something. She did not say any of this. She just held it. Later, when the fire had burned to deep red coals and the night outside had fully arrived, they all moved in the gradual, unhurried way of people who have nowhere to be. Good nights were said without ceremony, without the social performance of excessive warmth or the slight awkwardness of not knowing how to end. Just simple words and small gestures, and the natural separating of people who have spent a good evening and are ready to sleep. Marin climbed the stairs to her room. The candle on the writing table had been lit at some point during the evening by Teodora, she supposed, or perhaps by the inn itself, which she was beginning to think of as having its own quiet intentions. The room was warm. The coverlet had been turned back. Through the window, the orchard was invisible in the dark, but she knew it was there, and knowing it was there was a kind of company. She washed her face in the basin of warm water that had been left for her. She changed into the loose cotton she slept in. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the candle for a moment, at the flame which was perfectly still in the still air of the room. She thought about Percival and his rope. She thought about what lets go when you are finally in the right place. Then she lay down, pulled the coverlet over herself, and closed her eyes. The orchard was outside in the dark. The river was moving somewhere below in the valley. The stars Sella had promised were overhead, though she couldn't see them. The fire downstairs had gone to coals. Everything was as it should be. Segment 6, /voice style. Soft, calm female voice. Slow, steady pacing. Gentle, emotional warmth. Natural breathing pauses. Smooth bedtime narration. In the morning, there was mist. Marin woke slowly, the way you wake when you have slept deeply, and the sleep is not entirely finished with you. The room was pale, with the diffused gray-white light of a misty morning, soft and even without shadows. She lay still for a while, aware of the warmth of the coverlet, the particular quality of the silence, the faint smell of wood smoke that had found its way under the door. She had no pressing reason to get up. That thought arrived gently, like a small gift. She lay and listened to the morning. Somewhere below, she could hear the low sound of Teodora moving in the kitchen, water running, then the quiet knock of a pot being set on a stove, then silence, then the faint smell of coffee beginning its way through the old building. A bird she couldn't identify was singing in the orchard, a small repeating phrase, 3 notes up and 2 notes down, 3 notes up and 2 notes down, patient and precise and entirely without purpose except its own. When she finally rose and went to the window, the mist was lying in the valley like a slow breathing. The tops of the orchard trees just emerged from it, their upper branches visible, the apples hanging in the white air like small lanterns. The hills had disappeared. The river was completely hidden. The world had condensed to this one small area of visibility, the courtyard, the near trees, the gray stone of the well, and everything beyond was pale and soft and not yet. She dressed warmly and went downstairs. Sella was already in the kitchen, sitting at the corner of the long table with a cup of coffee and her own small notebook, writing something with quiet concentration. She looked up when Marin came in and lifted her cup in greeting, and Marin helped herself to coffee from the heavy ceramic pot on the stove and sat down across from her. And they didn't speak for a while, which was fine, which was one of the particular qualities of their friendship, the ease of shared silence, the absence of the obligation to fill space with words. Teodora was making bread. She stood at the long wooden counter with her back to the room, working the dough with the steady, rhythmic pressure of someone who has done this 10,000 times and found in its repetition not boredom, but a kind of meditation. The sound of it was gentle and consistent, the small percussion of dough on wood, the breath of effort, the silence between. The kitchen was the kind of room that knows what it is for and doesn't pretend to be anything else. The shelves held jars of preserves and dried things, and the tools of practical daily cooking. The windowsills held pots of herbs, thyme, rosemary, a trailing plant with small dark leaves whose name Marin didn't know. The walls were stone, hung with a few iron implements, and a small clock that ticked with the quietness of a clock that knows it is not the most important thing in the room. Outside, the mist held everything softly. After a while, Sella closed her notebook and said, "There is a path that follows the river to the eastern end of the valley. I want to show it to you." Marin looked at the mist through the kitchen window. "Now, the mist makes it better," Sella said. They wrapped themselves in their coats and their scarves, Marin in the terracotta one, which she touched with one hand before looping it around her neck, as she always did, and went out into the white morning. The mist was thicker than it had looked from the window. It had texture and weight. It moved against her face like cool breath. It muffled sound, so that her own footsteps on the courtyard stones seemed to come from somewhere nearby, but not quite where she was standing. The orchard was spectral, each tree appearing as she approached and disappearing behind her as she passed, as if the world were inventing itself precisely as she needed it. The path to the river ran along the edge of the orchard, and then down a gentle slope through a meadow that had gone to seed, the tall grasses pale and heavy with moisture, bending over the path and leaving dark, wet marks on the legs of her trousers as she moved through them. She didn't mind. Wet grass on a misty morning was one of those sensations that belonged entirely to being alive in a body, and she was grateful for it. The river emerged from the mist slowly, first a sound, then a movement, then the thing itself, low in its autumn banks, dark and clear and purposeful. It moved over rounded stones in a quiet conversation with itself, not rushing, just going steadily where it was going. They found the path that ran alongside it and walked together in comfortable silence, their breath making small clouds that joined the larger mist and disappeared. Willows trailed their pale arms into the water from the bank. A kingfisher, impossibly bright even in the gray morning, sat on a low branch above a quiet pool and watched the water with the focused serenity of something that knows exactly what it is doing. Marin stopped when she saw it and put her hand on Sella's arm, and they both stood still until the kingfisher decided they were not a threat and returned its full attention to the water. They walked for an hour along the river, not talking much, stopping occasionally when something asked to be looked at. A cluster of mushrooms at the base of an ash tree, orange and rust colored, opening into the damp morning like small paper parasols. The way the water broke over a particular arrangement of stones and made a low, continuous note that was almost musical. A section of bank where the river had cut through the earth over many years and exposed the layers, the dark topsoil, then clay, then a paler layer of something older, each layer a visible record of time. On the walk back, the mist had begun to thin. The sun was making its presence known, not yet visible, but illuminating from behind, turning the white mist to silver, then to pale gold at the edges. By the time they returned to the courtyard, the tops of the hills had reappeared, and the valley was revealing itself again in segments, like something slowly remembered. Teodora's bread was on the table. Sella arrived that afternoon. Marin was in the orchard, sitting at the base of an apple tree with her back against its trunk, and her notebook open on her knee, when she heard the sound of footsteps on the track. She looked up, and there was Sella, coming through the low wooden gate with a bag on each shoulder, her dark hair windblown, her face bright with the kind of happiness that is slightly out of breath. They had not seen each other in nearly 2 years. For a moment, they only looked at each other across the courtyard. Sella laughed, not loudly, but with her whole chest, the laugh that Marin had known for 30 years, the one that started deep and came out warm and crossed the courtyard in long, easy strides and put her arms around Marin. And they held each other the way old friends do, with full weight, without the slight awkwardness of people who are still deciding how close to stand. "You came," Sella said. "Of course I came," Marin said. "You almost didn't. I could tell by how long it took you to open the letter." Marin laughed now too, a sound she hadn't heard herself make in weeks. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I know you," Sella said simply. They pulled apart and looked at each other properly. There was the small reckoning that always happens between people who haven't seen each other in a long time, the quiet noting of how time has moved, without judgment, just observation. A few more lines, a little more gray, and underneath all of it, completely unchanged, the essential quality of the person, the particular light that only they carry. "You look tired," Sella said, not unkindly. As a fact, "I was," Marin said. "I think I'm less so now. The valley does something." Sella nodded as if this required no further explanation. "Wait until tonight. There are no other lights for miles. The stars here are extraordinary." They sat together under the apple tree for a while, talking in the way they always talked, not in a straight line, but circling around and through things, one subject leading naturally to another, and then doubling back, like a path through woods that seems to wander, but always brings you home. They talked about small things, about Marin's garden and Sella's work, and the price of good olive oil, and a film they had both seen and felt differently about. They talked about Marin's mother, gently and briefly, the way you touch something that is still tender. And then they were quiet together, and that was as good as the talking. The light in the orchard changed as the afternoon moved. The shadows lengthened, and the quality of the light shifted from bright and direct to something warmer and more angled, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look as though it is being seen for the last time and found beautiful. A breeze moved through the trees, and a few leaves came down, not urgently, not falling so much as descending, taking their time, choosing their landing. Teodora appeared with a tray that she set on the flat stone beside the well. On it were 2 cups of something hot, and a small plate of the inn's bread, and a jar of fig jam with a spoon. She said nothing, just set it down and went back inside, and Marin understood that this was how things happened here, quietly, with attention, without ceremony. Jam was dark and faintly spiced, the figs having been grown in the valley, Marin guessed, since everything here seemed to come from the valley. It tasted of long, slow summer, of heat and patience and sweetness that had been arrived at over a long time. She spread it on a thick slice of bread and ate it, and felt, very specifically, held. That was the word she had been reaching for since she arrived. Not comforted, though it was that. Not safe, though it was that too. The feeling was more particular than either of those. It was the feeling of being held, not restrained, not managed, but the way you are held when you fall asleep somewhere that knows you, and the world goes on being the world while you rest. She wrote the word in her notebook, just the single word, held. Then she underlined it once and closed the book. "What do people do here?" she asked Sella. Sella looked at the orchard, at the river just visible through the trees, at the smoke from the inn's chimney against the pale afternoon sky. "The same things people do everywhere," she said, "but slower, and on purpose." Later, as the sun dropped behind the western hill, and the valley filled with a soft blue dusk, they helped Teodora, and 2 other guests pressed the afternoon's harvest of apples. The press was an old wooden one in the low barn at the edge of the courtyard, its mechanisms worn to a particular smoothness by generations of use. It smelled magnificently of apple and wood and thyme. They took turns loading the press, and turning the great wooden screw and watching the pale gold juice run down the channel into the waiting vessel. It was work that required just enough attention to quiet the mind without exhausting it. The best kind of work, Marin had always thought. The kind that asks you to be present without demanding anything else. By the time they finished, the dusk had become evening, and the first stars were appearing above the ridge of the eastern hill. Sella had been right about the stars. Marin stood in the courtyard with apple-scented hands and looked up. That afternoon, Marin went into the orchard alone. She had been in the valley for only a day and a half, but she had already developed the particular relationship with the place that certain places invite, a sense of belonging without possession, of being welcome without being claimed. She moved through the orchard as if she had walked its grass paths before, though she hadn't, as if the trees recognized her, though of course they didn't. The orchard simply had that quality of knowing without knowing. She walked slowly, with no destination and no purpose except to be in the afternoon light among the trees. The mist was entirely gone now, and the day had opened into something clear and still, the air cool and clean, and carrying the scent of late apples and damp earth. The light came through the branches at a low angle. They were past the equinox now, the sun declining earlier each day, and every surface was illuminated with that specific afternoon gold that belongs entirely to October. She came to a part of the orchard she hadn't been in before, where the trees were older, their trunks thicker and more deeply furrowed, their shapes more individual, less regular. One tree in particular had grown in a way that suggested it had survived something difficult long ago. A large branch had come off at some point, leaving a healed place on the trunk, smooth and rounded, where the tree had grown around the wound over many decades, until it was not so much a scar as simply part of the shape of the tree. You had to look to notice it. And then once you noticed it, you couldn't look at the tree without seeing how completely it had been incorporated, made whole. Marin sat beneath this tree for a long time. She thought about her mother, as she often did in quiet moments. The last 2 years of visiting, of sitting beside the bed in the room that smelled of lavender and medication, of holding hands and being quiet together, of the small decisions that had to be made each week, and the way those decisions gradually became easier, not because they became less important, but because you learned to trust yourself to make them. Months of tending, and then the ending of the tending, and the strange hollow feeling afterward. Not grief exactly, grief was also there, but different, more the feeling of a purpose that has been met and is now complete, and you are left standing in the space where the purpose used to be. She had not, she realized, allowed herself to think about this in the way she was thinking about it now. At home, in her cottage, in the familiar geography of her ordinary life, there were too many small things to attend to, too many ways to stay busy without noticing you were staying busy. But here, in the valley, among trees that had learned to be shaped by what had happened to them, she found she could simply sit with it, not fix it, not resolve it, just sit with it. And that, she understood slowly, was what the valley was for. After a while, she opened her notebook and wrote for a time. Not anything formal or well constructed, just the movement of thoughts onto paper, the way you pour water from one vessel to another, not to change what the water is, but to see it more clearly. She wrote about her mother's hands. She wrote about the morning she had decided to come here, the letter on the mantel. She wrote about the feeling she had named the day before held, and then tried to write around it, to find the edges of it, to understand why that particular word had been the right one. She didn't arrive at any conclusions. That was all right. The orchard went on being the orchard. The light moved. An apple fell from a tree nearby with a soft sound, not a loud sound, not a crash, just the gentlest possible announcement of arrival on the grass. She looked at it lying there, round and red flushed, entirely at ease with having fallen. She smiled at that. When she gathered herself to leave, the light had reached the low golden stage that precedes dusk, and the whole orchard was warm with it. She stood and stretched and looked up through the branches at the sky, which was beginning to shift toward the first pale orange at the western edge. On her way back to the courtyard, she passed an older woman she had not yet met, sitting on a low wooden bench along the orchard path with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed. Not asleep. The quality of her stillness was too deliberate for sleep. Simply sitting, simply being in the afternoon. Marin passed her quietly, without disturbing. Inside, the fire had been built up again. Percival was in the sitting room with a book in his lap, and his glasses pushed up on his head, looking not at the book, but at the fire, in the way of someone who has gone past reading into thinking. He nodded at her as she came in, and she nodded back, and she went upstairs to her room. She washed the afternoon from her hands and face. She changed her damp trousers for dry ones. She stood at the window for a while and watched the last of the light leave the orchard. The trees were dark shapes now, their outlines visible against the sky, which had gone to deep rose in the west and a soft gray everywhere else. The apples were no longer individually visible. The trees were just the trees, present in the dusk. She lit the candle on the writing table. Its small flame was very steady. She thought about the healed tree, about the place where the branch had been, and was now only the memory of a branch, incorporated, made continuous. She held that thought for a while. Then she went down to dinner. On her third morning in the valley, Marin found a room she hadn't known existed. She had been looking for the linen cupboard. Teodora had mentioned something about extra blankets and pointed in a direction that Marin had not accurately remembered. And she had gone down a short hallway on the ground floor that she hadn't explored, past a door she had assumed was a storeroom, and tried the latch, and the door opened into a room that was entirely unexpected. It was a small room, square and low, with a window on each of its 3 windowed walls, one facing the orchard, one facing the lane, one facing the hillside to the north. It had no specific furniture, except for a long window seat that ran under all 3 windows, cushioned in faded blue-green fabric, the same color as the front door. Along one wall, shelves ran from floor to ceiling, holding a mixture of books, old ones with cloth spines in faded colors, paperbacks with creased covers, a few oversized ones lying flat, as well as small objects of the kind that accumulate in a place over many years without anyone quite intending it. A small clay bowl, smooth with handling, a twisted piece of driftwood, a jar of dried seed heads, a bird's nest, empty, perfectly formed. The light in the room was extraordinary, with 3 windows, all admitting the morning sun from different angles. The room was full of a bright, diffused, even warmth that had none of the harshness of direct sunlight. Everything in it was illuminated from several directions at once, so that nothing cast a sharp shadow. Even the dust motes moving in the air, and there were dust motes turning slowly in the light, which Marin found comforting in the way that only dust motes in morning sun are comforting. Even they were lit softly from all sides. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to the window seat under the orchard window and sat down. The orchard looked different from this low angle through glass in the full morning sun. The near trees were close enough that she could see individual leaves, each one turned slightly differently, catching the light at its own angle. Beyond them, the orchard receded, and beyond the orchard the meadow, and beyond the meadow the river, invisible but known. She had not brought her notebook or her book. She had nothing with her except herself. She sat and looked at the orchard and let her mind be quiet. It is a rare skill, being quiet. Not the absence of thought that isn't actually possible, or at least it wasn't for Marin, who had always had a lively interior life that declined to be fully silenced. But the quality of being quiet, which is something different. The thoughts moving through, but not being pursued. The mind like the river moving, always moving, but not forced. She had found it easier here than anywhere in recent memory. A cat she hadn't seen before appeared on the orchard path below the window. A gray cat, long and lean, moving with the focused authority of a cat who has made a decision and is carrying it out. It stopped beneath a tree, looked up at something Marin couldn't see, then sat, curled its tail around its feet, and looked out at the orchard with an expression of profound equanimity. Marin watched the cat for a long time. After a while, she reached for the nearest book on the shelf without really looking at it, and found she had chosen a collection of short essays about the natural world. She read 3 of them slowly, each one a few pages long, each one concerned with some small and ordinary thing. The first described the behavior of rivers in winter. The second was about a particular type of moth and its relationship to moonlight. The third was about the way old trees communicate with each other through the soil. A slow and continuous exchange of information in the dark. She had read about this last subject before and found it moving every time. The idea of trees talking to each other through their roots, over decades, over generations, the network of it invisible above ground, the exchange undetectable except to instruments and to people who are paying the right kind of attention. She thought about her grandmother's cottage, her own cottage, and the years of quiet lives in its walls. She thought about what is transmitted without words over time through the simple accumulation of presence. When Sella found her, an hour or more later, the sun had moved and the light in the room had changed, but had not diminished, only shifted. "I've been looking for you," Sella said, though without any urgency. I found a room, Marin said. Sella looked around the small space with its 3 windows, and its shelves, and its gray light transformed to gold. The reading room, she said. Teodora calls it the in-between room because it faces 3 different directions. She says it belongs to 3 different times of day at once. Marin looked at the 3 windows. The orchard, the lane, the hillside. That's exactly right, she said. They stayed in the in-between room together for another hour. Marin reading and Sella writing in her notebook, and both of them occasionally looking up to share a sentence or a thought, and then returning to their separate quiet. The gray cat came in at some point, jumped to the window seat between them, turned once, and settled. Its weight against Marin's leg was warm and precise. Outside, the valley was going about its day. Smoke from the chimney, birds in the orchard, the slow river moving toward wherever rivers go. Inside, the light turned slowly in the 3 windows. The last evening arrived with the particular sweetness of things that are nearly over. Marin had known since the morning that she would leave the following day. Not because she had to, or because something was demanding her return, but because she could feel that the visit had found its natural shape. There is a completeness to certain times. You can sense it the way you can sense when a piece of music is approaching its final movement, not with sadness, but with a kind of attentive appreciation, a willingness to be fully present for the ending. She spent the day moving slowly through the places she had come to love. The orchard in the morning, walking the grass paths between the old trees one more time, touching the bark of the healed tree, sitting for a while under its branches, and writing a few last things in her notebook. The in-between room for an hour in the afternoon, in the company of the gray cat. A walk along the river with Sella, this time in clear afternoon light that was very different from the misty morning of 2 days ago. The water bright and visible, the willows golden, everything showing itself clearly because it could. They walked to the eastern end of the valley, where the river turned and disappeared between 2 rocky outcroppings, and stood there together, watching the water for a while. "What will you do when you get home?" Sella asked. Marin thought about it. "I think I'll write some letters," she said. "I've been slow with letters lately." She paused. "And I want to start walking again in the mornings. Before I got too busy, I used to walk every morning, just for an hour." I stopped. She looked at the river. "I want to start again." "That's not nothing," Sella said. "No," Marin agreed. "It's not." They stood a while longer. The sun was at that late afternoon angle now, and the eastern outcroppings threw long shadows across the water. On the rocks above, a small plant she couldn't identify was growing in a crack, its roots finding purchase in the stone, its leaves still green despite the season. "Will you come back here?" Marin asked. "In spring, I think," Sella said. "The orchard in blossom. Teodora described it once, and I've been trying to get here in April ever since." She smiled. "You should come too." "Yes," Marin said, not the qualified yes she often gave, leaving room for postponement. Just yes. The walk back was easy and quiet, the valley settling into its evening routine around them. At the far end, a light appeared in one of the barn windows. Smoke rose steadier now from the inn's chimney. The dog was asleep in his usual patch, which had moved with the sun throughout the day, and was now a long, low stripe of last light on the courtyard stones. Dinner that evening had a different quality, warm still, easy still, but with the slight heightening of attention that comes at the end of something. Percival spoke for longer than usual, telling stories about the valley in other decades, other guests, things he had observed over 40 years of visits. The young couple from the coast held hands under the table in the unself-conscious way of people in love who have temporarily forgotten that others can see. Inez read a single paragraph from what she was writing. She didn't offer to. She was simply asked and said yes. And what she read was very good, concerned with the quality of light in the late afternoon and the way it changed the character of familiar things. Marin ate and listened and looked around the table at these people she had known for 3 days and would likely not see again, most of them, or perhaps see once more in years, and felt the specific warmth of that, of the brief and complete kinds of connection, the ones that don't require continuity to be real. After dinner, she said good night to Sella in the hallway, and they held each other for a moment the way they had in the orchard when Sella had arrived. "Thank you for the letter," Marin said. "Thank you for opening it," Sella said. She went upstairs to her room for the last time. She didn't rush. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, looking at the room in the candlelight. The white coverlet, the writing table with its candle and its cup of rosemary, which had dried to a silver green over the days and smelled faint and clean. The worn oak floor with its single rug. The window, dark now, the orchard invisible. She opened her notebook and read through what she had written over the 3 days. The word held, underlined. The paragraph about her mother's hands. The sentence about the healed tree. The observation about roots and what is transmitted without words. Small things, all of them, but they felt true, which is all she ever asked of what she wrote. She added one more sentence at the end of the last page. She wrote, "Some places teach you what rest is, and you carry the lesson home in your body." Then she closed the notebook. She went to the window and stood there in the dark, not looking at anything because there was nothing to see, just being present in front of the glass, aware of the orchard on the other side of it, the trees standing in the night, the river somewhere below in the dark, the stars above the valley that Sella had promised, and that Marin had seen on every clear night and not tired of. She put one hand flat on the cool glass of the window, a gesture of thanks, to the valley, to the inn, to the trees and the water and the mist and the light, to Teodora, who had placed warm water bottles and lit candles and said exactly the right amount, to Percival and his rope that had let go, to Inez and her careful attention, to the gray cat and the kingfisher and the apple that had fallen and lay in the grass entirely at ease, to the healed tree above all. She stood there for a moment, hand on the glass. Then she let go and went to bed. In the morning, she walked home. She left early, before most of the inn was awake, in the blue-gray hour before sunrise, when the world is still deciding what kind of day it will be. She had said her goodbyes the evening before to Teodora, briefly and warmly, and to the others, so she had only to pick up her bag and go down the stairs and through the kitchen, where the fire was already going, though no one was yet in the room. She paused in the kitchen. The fire, the quiet, the smell of stone and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of apples that had permeated the whole building. She looked at the empty chairs around the long table, the jar of fig jam still on the shelf, the ceramic coffee pot cold on its hook. She carried all of it with her when she went out. The courtyard was silvery in the pre-dawn. The stones were cold under her feet. The well stood at the center with its wooden roof, patient as always. The gate opened with its familiar creak, which she had come to find comforting, the way you come to find familiar sounds comforting, not because the sound is beautiful, but because it means you are somewhere specific, somewhere known. She walked up the track through the orchard in the near dark. The trees were gray shapes, their leaves dimly visible, the apples here and there catching even the small pre-dawn light and holding it faintly like embers. She touched the bark of the healed tree as she passed it, a greeting and a farewell at once. Then the track became the lane, and the lane became the road, and the road began to rise toward the hawthorn banks, where she had first heard the sound of the water days ago, coming the other way. She did not look back, not from any resolve or deliberate discipline. It simply did not occur to her. She was already carrying the valley with her, and you do not need to look at what you are already holding. The road rose through the hawthorn banks, and the sound of the river fell away behind her, gradually, the way sounds do when you walk away from their source. Slowly, it became a murmur, and then a suggestion, and then it was gone, and there was only the sound of her own footsteps and the birds beginning their morning, the earliest ones calling in the dark with a kind of hopeful insistence, as if they are each trying to be the one that brings the light. She walked through the salt marshes again as the sun began to arrive. The light came up from behind the eastern hills in a long, slow brightening. First just a paling of the sky, then a band of gold at the horizon, then the sun itself appearing, huge and unhurried, pulling the day up with it. The marsh water caught this light with immediate generosity. Each pool became a mirror of rose and gold, perfectly flat, perfectly still in the early morning calm. The sedge grass along the edges was lit from the side, each stem distinct and luminous. The heron was there again, or a different heron. It was impossible to tell, standing in its usual pool on its usual leg, with its usual expression of absolute patience. Marin walked and watched the light come up. There was a fullness in her that she hadn't carried when she had walked this road in the other direction 4 days ago. It was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than happiness. It was what happens when you have rested in the right place and been reminded of something you had known but forgotten. Not a revelation, not a transformation, just a remembering. She had spent 2 years being close to the ground, close to the specific weight of caring for someone, and then the specific weight of loss, and then the specific weight of after loss, which has its own particular gravity. And she had been fine. She had been more than fine. She had been present and loving and capable through all of it. But somewhere in those 2 years, she had also become slightly too small in herself, slightly contracted around the effort of it, and the valley had simply expanded her again, the way warmth expands a room. She reached the village in the late morning. The baker was outside, sweeping his doorstep. He looked up as she passed. "Somewhere good?" he asked again. "Yes," she said. Not the same yes as 4 days ago, a fuller one. She walked down the lane to her cottage. The fig tree was leaning over the gate, as always. The roses had done whatever they had done in her absence, and would tell her about it in their own time. The key was in her coat pocket. The door opened with its familiar sound into the familiar smell of her own home, woodsmoke and dried herbs, and the unnamed sweetness that was simply the accumulated years of the place. She set her bag down. She opened the windows to let the morning in. Then she put the kettle on, and while it heated, she stood in the middle of her kitchen and breathed. In through the nose, slowly, all the way down. Out through the mouth, slowly, all the way. Again. The morning was in the room now, cool and bright, and moving gently through the open window, carrying the smell of the garden, the last of the season's roses, the earth beginning its slow turning toward winter. The kettle ticked quietly on the stove. The curtain shifted in the breeze. She sat in her chair by the window with her tea, the same chair that had held her when she had first read Sella's letter. It held her again now, shaped as it was to her, giving way under her weight in all the exact right places. The hills were gold in the October light. She thought about the healed tree, about what grows over wounds given enough time and the right conditions, about the valley lying in its cupped hills 2 hours to the east, full of orchard light and river sound, and the smell of apple press and wood smoke, and the accumulated quiet of lives lived gently. She would go back in April. She had said yes, and she meant it. But for now, just for now, she was here, in her chair, in her house. The hills outside familiar and golden, the tea warm in her hands, the window open to the morning. Let the morning come in. Let the breath go slow. Let the hands lie still and open. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing unfinished. Everything that needed to happen today has already happened, and everything else can wait until tomorrow, and tomorrow is a long way away. This is enough. You are enough. The quiet is enough. Let the afternoon arrive when it arrives. Let the evening come in its own time, turning the light from gold to amber to lavender, the way it always does, the way it will again tonight, the way it has for as long as there have been evenings. And the stars will come out over the hills, and the houses will put on their soft lights, and the world will go on being the world, doing all the things the world does while you are sleeping. And you can rest now, gently, all the way down, into the warmth, into the dark, into the quiet that holds you. You are held. You are safe. Rest now.